Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your source material, your research, and your notes, and we turn them into actionable, unforgettable insight.
And today, we are definitely steering clear of the usual topics.
We're not talking tech reports, we're not talking global finance, we're looking at something much more intimate, I think, more foundational.
Yeah, we're talking about the simple, noisy, chaotic act of just going to a traditional market.
And you, the listener, you brought us a really incredible stack of sources for this one. It's such an unexpected blend.
It really is. It's a full-on philosophical analysis of modern commerce, but it's viewed almost entirely through the lens of all people, Albert Camus.
Which at first sounds like a strange pairing, but as the material shows, it's a profoundly necessary one for our age of, total convenience.
Absolutely. The whole deep dive really starts with this amazing question, one we usually just dismiss as like an economic inefficiency.
Right. The question is basically this. If modern life lets us buy literally anything instantly, often cheaper, often even higher quality.
And almost always without leaving your house.
Without leaving your house.
Yeah.
So why do people still choose to go to a traditional, hot, crowded, open-air market?
I mean, just think about that decision for a second. Why would you endure the summer heat, the crowds, the noise, having to haggle, the waiting?
It makes no sense. By every standard that modern efficiency measures, it is an objectively a suboptimal choice.
Totally suboptimal. If you're a purely rational economic actor, you'd never make that choice. You'd click the button, you'd choose the one-click buy.
And we usually see this whole thing through that one lens.
Right.
The transactional one. Buying, paying, going home.
But Camus, as your sources point out so well, he wouldn't even ask if the market is efficient. He would just stop at that very first observation.
The fact that the suboptimal choice still exists.
Exactly. And that paradox of inefficiency, that's the core mission of this entire deep dive.
We're going to be looking way beyond the price tag, beyond the product. We're analyzing the existential choice behind the transaction.
It's the decision to actively choose presence, just being physically there, over this total, seamless, and maybe slightly sterile optimization.
And the sources frame the market not as some, sentimental relic of the past.
No.
They frame it as a critical anchor point in a world that is becoming, and this is a great phrase, dangerously smoothed over by convenience.
And if Camus were walking through a modern city today, he'd argue that these markets, these chaotic, rough, and slightly annoying spaces, they're some of the very last public zones where human existence hasn't been completely filtered,
intermediated,
or just consumed as passive data. And we're going to unpack exactly how that whole mechanism works over the next 30 minutes or so.
Okay, let's start there. Let's unpack this idea of inefficiency actually being desirable. I mean, historically, going to the market was just a chore, right?
Yeah.
The transaction.
It was.
But the source material points to this very strange, very modern feeling, and I think everyone listening is going to recognize this. Why do you often feel distinctly lighter or maybe more energized after a trip to a traditional market, even if you didn't buy anything important, even if you left empty-handed?
That feeling of lightness is absolutely critical. That's the philosophical reward, not the economic one.
Right.
And it speaks directly to what Camus identified as the modern affliction. He argued that modern suffering, it doesn't really stem from a lack of things or even a lack of convenience.
It comes from something else.
It comes from a profound, deep-seated loss of direct contact with existence. We're insulated.
And modern life is structured to just keep reinforcing that insulation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every app personalizes your experience. Every store curates the ambiance.
Every transaction is intermediated by a screen, by an algorithm. They're all designed to filter the roughness out of life.
Exactly. And that filtering, it creates this kind of existential distance.
It does. But the market, just by its very nature, it refuses to play that game. It refuses to participate in the smoothing. Markets were structurally rough. They're loud, they're chaotic, often physically uncomfortable.
And fundamentally non-standardized. There's no corporate mandate on the layout or the tone of voice.
No, and I think we need to linger on that sensory experience for a moment because that's where the sources really get it right.
Right.
When you're in a sterile, modern supermarket, the whole environment is designed to be odorless, quiet, except for some soft music.
Everything's visually ordered, packaged, and predictable.
Yes. But in the traditional market, the sensory load it's overwhelming. You smell the raw earth, the sharp scent of cut herbs, the the metallic tang of fish,
The musk of sweat and heat.
and the sweetness of fruit all at once. It's this chaotic, simultaneous input, this lack of polish that gives us that rare modern feeling.
Which is,
The sensation of being dropped with no safety gear right into the middle of the world.
meaning no one is optimizing your path for you.
Yeah.
No one is monitoring your basket to suggest, oh, you might like this based on your last 7 purchases.
And the world doesn't adjust its lighting or its rhythm to your emotional state. It just doesn't care. You simply collide with reality as it is, not reality as it's been, rendered for your consumption. And that collision is a kind of existential confirmation.
In that chaotic space, you're not just a customer. You're not a data profile,
You're just a physical presence.
a body among other bodies, a voice among other voices, a breath among others, forced to share the same air.
And that's such a powerful contrast to digital spaces, or even highly curated physical ones, where your presence is entirely defined by your intent to consume.
Or your profile history.
Exactly. When you're standing at a market stall, the only thing that really matters is that present moment,
Yeah.
that exchange. Not your demographic, not your past purchases, not your politics.
Which brings us to this really profound paradox that the sources highlight. In the market, the world doesn't revolve around you,
Not at all. The seller is probably preoccupied with something else.
and the other buyers are definitely ignoring who you are. The world is just moving on its own rhythm, totally indifferent to your needs.
And paradoxically, that exact feeling of not being the center of the universe is what makes you feel profoundly less isolated.
That's fascinating. Why?
Well, Kim misunderstood this. True human meaning, it doesn't require the world to prioritize you. It requires sharing a common reality with other people.
So when the world is constantly shrinking to perfectly fit your ego, your preferences.
You get isolated inside that personalized bubble, and that's a huge source of modern anxiety.
So the market isn't offering some grand narrative. It doesn't tell you who to be. It doesn't solve your life's problem.
No, it just says one very simple, very blunt thing.
Which is
You are here. And you are among other people who are also here, struggling and moving and breathing. That's it.
It's the ultimate antidote to the curated life.
It is. So the core insight here is that the market is no longer just an economic space. It's become one of these rare places where you can simply exist without being optimized or identified.
Or consumed as data.
Exactly. The transaction is almost secondary. The existential confirmation. That's
Right.
primary.
And that confirmation is the feeling. That's the lightness we feel when we leave. We haven't necessarily gotten the best deal, but we've confirmed our own reality.
Exactly. And to really understand the market's power here, we have to look at its enemy, optimization.
Right.
Camus wouldn't start this analysis with money. He wouldn't start with finance. He'd start with the fundamental rhythm of life. Before economics is about numbers, it's about how humans organize time and their own bodies.
Okay, let's challenge that for a second, because most people see optimization as a good thing. It saves time, saves money, reduces stress. Why would Camus or our sources see that logic as corrosive?
Because modern commerce, as your sources detail so well, is driven by this desire to optimize everything. Optimize routes, optimize time, optimize choice, optimize comfort.
And the goal of all that optimization is
The specific, often unspoken goal is the complete elimination of something the sources call unnecessary presence,
unnecessary presence. So anything that slows the transaction down.
or doesn't directly contribute to the profit margin.
Yeah. So we're talking about delay, conversation, waiting, just thinking.
Precisely. The logic of optimization sees those moments as wasteful. They're slow, they're unmeasurable, they don't generate direct profit, and they introduce variables the system can't control.
So modern retail spaces, the supermarkets, the delivery apps, they're all designed to be frictionless pipelines.
Exactly. You enter as data, or maybe a trolley, at one end, and you exit as a completed transaction at the other. There's no friction. There is absolutely no in-between space designed into the system.
And Camus would really fixate on that term, in between.
He would. Because the truly human part of life, the part we remember, the part that shapes us, the part where we connect with the absurdity of it all, it happens in that messy middle space.
Not at the start or the end of a process.
No, in the process itself. And this is where the value of inconvenience just completely flips.
Because traditional markets, they retain that in-between space. They have to. They're just too inefficient to erase it.
They cannot smooth over the reality of human interaction. They force you to acknowledge that reality just won't adjust to your personal timeline.
You have to wait for the vendor to finish with the person in front of you. You have to physically move your body to avoid someone else's basket.
You have to accept delay. And that inconvenience, far from being a flaw, is a structural requirement. It forces you to stay rooted in the present moment rather than just mentally gliding to the next item on your to-do list.
It's interesting, Kim has suggested modern alienation doesn't just come from being overworked. It comes from the inability to simply be in your own experience without a goal.
Right. And modern spaces are designed for continuous, smooth, goal-directed movement. They don't let you just stand still in your own reality.
Think about the little details of the market that the sources describe.
Go on.
A vendor might just start talking for 5 minutes about their day. Or a buyer stands there selecting tomatoes, like one by one, inspecting every single one.
Or a bargain goes nowhere because the vendor is just stubborn. Economically, that is pure waste. It's a sunk cost.
Existentially, though.
Existentially, it is time that has not been consumed by purpose. It's a moment that serves no grand function, but it allows a person to feel the simple rhythm of being alive with others.
So the value system is completely different.
Yeah.
Modern value is tied to speed, efficiency, convenience.
And presence, just being there, falls into the category of redundancy.
Which brings us back to that question of fatigue. I find this comparison in the sources so insightful.
Yeah.
Why are we often just wiped out after a day in a highly optimized, air-conditioned mall, but then feel lighter after a few hours in a hot, noisy, crowded market?
The sources explain this from a Camusian perspective. True fatigue, it doesn't come from physical inconvenience, not really. It comes from the deeper exhaustion of not being fully present as a whole person.
So in the optimized space, you're served, you're catered to.
But you're constantly being reduced to a function, a consumer, a wallet, a data input. You're not really there. You're just a function moving along a pre-designed track.
But in the market,
You might be poorly served. You might not even get what you want. You might be frustrated. But you are there. Your physicality, your momentary decision, your interaction, it's accepted as real.
and being there, it lets you see other lives that haven't been packaged for you. You see old faces, you hear familiar voices.
You watch movements that have been repeated for years. The sources call this spatial memory, not personal memory.
That's a beautiful concept. Memory that doesn't need a story or a milestone, just the repetition of being in a place.
Exactly. The market keeps that sense of continuity alive precisely because it hasn't been sterilized by that ruthless, linear logic of pure economic optimization.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit from the waste of the market to its actual mechanism. The sources say Camus wouldn't romanticize it as some cultural treasure.
No, he'd be much more practical. He'd focus on one essential operational truth. The market is fundamentally unprogrammed.
And that's not in a technological sense.
No, not at all. It's in an existential sense. It just doesn't follow a technical predictive logic.
That distinction feels really important because when we interact with almost any modern commercial space, an app, a store, a recommendation engine, we're not really stepping into the world.
No, you're stepping into a version of the world that's been meticulously pre-prepared for you. It anticipates your movements, it guides your gaze, it shapes your choices.
The source material calls this a subtle but an insidious form of alienation.
It is. You don't collide with the world itself, you collide with the smoothed over, prefabricated copy of it. The world is just waiting for you to behave as predicted because it was designed around your predictability.
But the market requires you to, as the sources put it, go by yourself. There are no optimal routes laid out on the floor. There's no suggested order for the stalls.
No recommendation engine saying, because you bought X last week, this fishmonger should be your next stop. You're not led. You have to use your own internal, self-directed navigation.
And that necessity, the need to navigate on your own, to orient yourself, it demands that you exercise a skill.
Yes, instantaneous judgment. And it's a critical human skill that is rapidly disappearing in our data-driven lives.
Let's go back to that vegetable stall example and really break it down.
Okay.
You're standing there. You need to buy a head of lettuce. Online, that lettuce has 5-star ratings, reviews about its crispness, a guarantee of freshness. It's a light, risk-free decision.
Right, but in the market, there are no ratings. There is no certainty. All you have is the color, the wetness, the smell, the texture when you touch it.
The vendor's demeanor.
And your own vague, internalized, maybe even forgotten knowledge of what a good head of lettuce is supposed to look like.
This isn't just a transaction.
No, it's an active existence. You have to decide in uncertainty based only on your own immediate sensory input.
And that uncertainty, it makes you fully present in the decision, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because the consequences of a bad choice, a rotten lettuce, paying too much, they fall completely on you.
Exactly. In the algorithmic space, the decision is lightened. The risk is distributed to the system. If the lettuce is bad, you complain to customer service. Responsibility is diffused.
But the market, because it's unprogrammed, it returns that choice squarely to your hands.
And Camus believed people only truly exist when they're forced to take responsibility for their choices, even the small, mundane ones. The market forces you to make these continuous, small, consequential choices.
Let's also talk about the lack of personalization, because that's a key invisible mechanism here. Modern life, especially online, revolves entirely around you.
What you like, what you need, your next view, your personalized feed.
The world is intentionally shrunk down to fit the dimensions of your ego.
And Camus would have seen that shrinkage with intense suspicion. A world that always revolves around you is fundamentally too small for you to exist freely in relation to other people.
But the market just doesn't care who you are.
It doesn't. It doesn't change its prices or its chaos based on your mood. You enter a flow that existed before you and will continue long after you leave.
And that feeling of unimportance, the realization that the universe isn't designed for your comfort, it paradoxically makes you feel more real.
More anchored to reality. You realize you're a part of something vast, not the totality of the experience. It connects you to something larger than yourself.
And the sources also emphasize the value of uncontrolled randomness.
Yes. In the optimized space, randomness is the enemy. It's an error to be fixed. But in the market, randomness is just inherent.
You run into people you didn't plan to meet. You overhear stories you weren't looking for.
You see unfiltered, sometimes ugly, scenes that weren't designed to impress you. And this randomness, it has no goal. It doesn't optimize anything.
But it throws the door open to the world as unpredictable, which Camus valued as the source of human consciousness. The world is too predictable, we lose the urgency to be fully present.
Randomness forces presence because it demands alertness. You have to be alert, you have to look, you have to listen because you can't anticipate what's coming next.
And this is why memory works so differently here. I mean, ask yourself, when was the last time you clearly remembered a quick, functional trip to a chain store versus an unexpected moment at a chaotic market?
The market moment sticks. Maybe it was a heated argument or a specific smell you couldn't place.
Because memory isn't born from comfort or convenience.
No, it's born from unprogrammed collision and uncertainty. The market holds on to the necessary uncertainty of life. And where uncertainty remains, there is a true opportunity to fully be there.
So moving into the actual existential state the market provides. The sources are careful not to romanticize it. It is rough, it's loud, it's sometimes exhausting.
It is, but in that very roughness, there's a unique kind of silent liberation. And that is the freedom to exist without the pressure to perform.
That feels essential for the modern soul.
It is. Think about the nature of modern fatigue. Most of our contemporary spaces, the office, social media, even a curated park, they all require a performance. You have to constantly be something.
The optimal worker, the predictable user, the successful parent.
The politically informed citizen. It's the continuous management of a personal brand.
Exactly.
And this pressure to constantly define yourself, optimize yourself, represent yourself, it's relentless, even when it's unspoken. Camus called it the fatigue of always having to be. You're never just you, you're always you performing a role.
But at the market, all of that just, it dissolves. No one needs to know your political affiliation or your career goals. You can just be silent.
You can make mundane small talk about the price of peppers. You can just stand there and look, and no one judges you for it. The market allows for presence without reference.
It's a liberation from that continuous self-definition that the rest of society demands.
It is. You don't have to justify your existence. You just need to show up and buy your stuff.
And this leads to what the sources call the rough equality of the body, which feels so poignant today.
It does. In the market, everyone crowds together. Everyone is hot. Everyone has to physically dodge the same obstacles. There's no filter. There's no design distance.
And crucially, no VIP line.
No VIP line. And when the physical body is centered in this shared reality, the illusion of separation just dissolves. The sources describe a scene where a wealthy shopper and a daily laborer are both waiting impatiently for the same cabbage.
Standing in the same dust, experiencing the same sensory overload.
They're not meeting as abstract opinions. They're not meeting as opposing demographics. They're meeting as physical presences sharing the same small hardship.
And that's a fleeting but very true form of social leveling.
It is. In the market, you don't debate ideologies. You collide, you apologize, you share a moment of frustration at the long line. This doesn't create political consensus, but it does create the shared feeling of occupying the same ground.
And Camus would say that humans can endure almost any absurdity as long as they share that same bedrock of physical, undeniable reality.
Right. And then there's the question of tempo. The modern world moves faster than our human capacity to fully live it. We react before we feel. We move on before we settled into the moment.
Our consciousness is always like one step ahead of our bodies.
Exactly. But at the market, things slow down, sometimes frustratingly so. But it's not because of some scheduled meditation session.
Right.
It's because the physical, non-optimized process simply cannot go any faster. That's the critical distinction. This inherent slowness, it forces a pause.
And Camus would identify this forced slowdown as the right tempo, the pace at which human consciousness can actually anchor itself to reality.
Your senses are re-engaged. You stop processing and you start perceiving. You smell the fish, you hear the vendor's call, you see the hands weighing the produce. Your consciousness stops drifting away because the environment requires you to just look and listen and wait.
Which explains that observation that we often don't reach for our phones in the market. It's not just politeness.
No, it's because the surrounding physical world is thick enough to hold our attention there without needing digital stimulation.
It's the rare feeling of presence that doesn't need a notification or new content or validation.
It just needs a world that hasn't been thinned out into data streams. And the final point here is this feeling of belonging without uniformity.
Meaning, your sense of belonging is based on sharing the same space, the same morning routine, not shared beliefs or values.
And this is the durable, Camusian form of belonging. It requires no promises, no declaration of ideology. It's based entirely on sharing the same physical reality. And because it asks so little of your curated identity, this form of belonging is profoundly resilient.
So we need to be clear here. The market doesn't promise to solve our existential crises. It's not going to make people better.
No, but the sources argue, very convincingly, that it functions as a necessary mechanism to keep us from becoming existentially empty too quickly. It acts as a profound anchor point for our identity.
Let's talk about how modern spaces actively erode identity. The sources use this powerful term, the silent fragmentation of the self. What does that actually look like?
Well, it's the result of continuous role switching in all these optimized spaces. You're a highly professional manager on Zoom. A second later, you're a passive consumer on an app. Then you're a curated profile on social media.
Then a demographic data point for your smart speaker.
Exactly. You role switch so quickly and so thoroughly that the core self becomes silent. It gets fragmented into just a sequence of reactions to external demands. We lose the thread of who we are underneath the performance.
And the fatigue comes from constantly trying to manage all those different roles and makes them feel coherent.
Precisely. But in the market, you are simply the person going to the market. The role requires no performance upgrade, no specific presentation, no complex self-management.
Your identity is held in its rough, continuous shape. You're the same person you were last week on that same path.
And that repetition, seeing the same stall, the same people, walking the same worn route, it creates the essential continuity of life. Without that, our identity becomes just a series of chaotic reactions. The market provides an unintended, stabilizing rhythm, sustained purely by habit.
And this repetition leads directly to memory, specifically what the sources call the memory of presence versus the memory of an event.
Let's expand on that. A memory of event is something with a clear narrative arc, right? A graduation, a wedding, a big trip. The market fosters memory without that structure. The familiar stall is still there. The usual voice still rings out. The repeated smell of spices hits you in the same spot. These aren't major events. They're memories that live in the body.
You remember the path without thinking. You recognize a vendor's posture without needing to know their name.
So modern life pushes memories into our head, into the narrative part of our mind. It often needs a photo or a social media post to validate it.
But the market keeps memories in the body, in the feet, the hands, the nose.
And this sustains that powerful feeling of, I am still living here and life continues. It's a vital sense of uninterrupted reality. It provides emotional stability without needing continuous stimulation.
Because modern people, living in these fragmented, high-speed worlds, often lack emotional anchor points. We swing wildly based on external stimulus, like constant notifications.
Right. The market offers no drama, no shocks, no new content designed to capture your attention. but it offers a familiar, steady physical rhythm that keeps the mind from being swept away.
And Camus argued that humans endure the absurdity of existence through these repetitive actions that anchor them to reality.
And the market provides this unintended, stabilizing framework just by existing day after day in the same way.
And maybe the most liberating personal impact is the reduced pressure to be meaningful. In modern optimized spaces, everything from your coffee to your hobbies, it has to be valuable, optimal, worthwhile. You have to justify the time spent.
But going to the market doesn't need to be worthwhile in that grand sense. It's just a necessary, often annoying part of being alive. And it's precisely these unspoken parts of life, the moments without a grand message or a performance goal, that prevent existence from becoming a constant project.
And when everything is a project, your job, your dating life, your fitness, you just get exhausted from the constant self-management.
The market allows a brief, unmanaged respite from all that striving, but the deepest impact of all is that feeling of living in a common world, not one that's personalized or filtered for you.
But one shared physical reality. You're not the center of it, but you definitely have a real physical place within it.
Meaning doesn't require prioritization. It just requires sharing a foundation, sustained by habit and presence, rather than by big, abstract ideals.
And this is where the whole philosophical analysis becomes so relevant to our daily lives. This is the great paradox of efficiency.
It is.
Why are the spaces we deem most inefficient becoming essential for our spiritual and psychological well-being in an age that is obsessed with efficiency?
It's the ultimate existential paradox. Efficiency is brilliant at solving problems. It gets you from A to B faster, cleaner, and cheaper. But it is completely powerless to answer the question of why humans should live when all the immediate problems are solved.
And the sources emphasize that modern economics is all about removing friction. The friction of time, of the body, of communication, of uncertainty.
But Camus understood that friction is where consciousness is born. When everything is perfectly smooth, we just glide through life without ever realizing we're moving or where we're going. The absence of friction equals the absence of awareness.
And the market exists as this slight physical force of resistance. It's not enough to stop progress, but just enough to slow our steps and make us look down at our feet.
And that slight slowness, that necessary resistance, is what makes it irreplaceable. So we're not saying the market is objectively better than the mall or an app.
Yeah.
We're saying they serve two completely different and equally critical human needs. Optimized spaces serve the need for fast, clean, goal-directed transactions.
And markets serve the deep human need to just be in the world without a clear purpose.
Right. The economy, being a rational system, understands that first need perfectly. But it is entirely powerless against the second need, the existential one.
So spaces like the traditional market become these silent, vital zones that handle what the optimized system can't process. Our messy, uncertain physical reality.
Our sources call this the silent reliance of the efficient system on what it judges to be obsolete, these redundant zones.
So the threat then, when a market is dismissed as backward and replaced by a shiny, efficient mall, it isn't just a threat to a business model.
No, it's a threat to a way of existing. We lose a vital anchor point. Humans don't live by optimized profit margins. They live by the feeling of still being in the world, unedited and uncurated.
And the deeper paradox is that the more we optimize the front end of our lives, the more critical our need for these inefficient, redundant zones becomes.
Just to prevent widespread existential emptiness, the market doesn't need growth or expansion or disruptive innovation. It only needs simple, reliable repetition.
And that power of repetition, the rhythm that anchors us, is its true strength. When those spaces vanish, life just becomes a series of disjointed, high-speed events with no foundation.
Which brings us to a really heavy question. If markets vanished entirely tomorrow, where would we place our feeling of being in the world?
It wouldn't be in an application or an interface.
No, because interfaces only let us move forward to the next purchase, the next piece of content. They never let us simply stand still in the current reality.
So the price of losing them isn't just nostalgia, it's the disappearance of these existential anchor points.
And Camus wouldn't mandate preservation. He'd just demand that we become conscious of that price before we choose the optimized replacement.
So the answer isn't necessarily just preserving every old building.
No, the source material suggests the true path is in adopting the attitude of the market, what the text calls unpurposeful attention.
Okay, let's define that clearly. What is unpurposeful attention, and how can we practice it outside of a dusty market?
Unpurposeful attention is the active choice to observe your surroundings and be fully present without aiming for optimization or results or your next move. It's attention that doesn't ask, what am I supposed to do with this?
So if I apply that to, say, a highly optimized space like a supermarket, instead of rushing for the milk, I would just stop and truly look at the way the light is hitting the floor, or listen to the chatter of the people around me.
Or truly feel the weight of the basket in your hand, for no other reason than to just be there.
Right.
We have to relearn the ability to be in the world without continuous manipulation. You can't fast forward or skip the market experience, but you can choose to look and listen and touch and wait.
And those small actions make the fundamental difference between living and just existing emptily.
Exactly. Optimization is a choice. It's not an inescapable destiny. The market is simply the undeniable physical proof that this stance, the stance of unpurposeful attention, is still possible.
This has been a really expansive look at the inefficiency we, perhaps unknowingly, crave. So to quickly summarize our key takeaways, markets provide an unfiltered presence that acts as a profound counter to modern alienation. They force us into small, instantaneous existential choices, which reasserts our personal responsibility.
Right.
They offer a deep sense of belonging based on sharing the same physical ground, not a shared ideology. And crucially, they stabilize our fragmented identity through simple, continuous repetition.
The central paradox we've explored is that this modern, highly rational system has to rely silently on what it deems obsolete, these non-modern, inefficient spaces, to provide the balance we need for psychological survival.
The responsibility, as Kamos would see it, lies in retaining and creating moments where life isn't thin.
Not by preserving the specific forms of the market, but by practicing conscious presence wherever and whenever we can. It fundamentally changes how you view a trip to the store.
It really does.
So here's our final provocative thought for you to carry forward into your week. If tomorrow every single space you enter were completely optimized for speed and efficiency, how would you still know how to remain fully in the world without constantly turning yourself into an operation, a function, or a product manager of your own life?
Because the market isn't important because of what it sells. It is important because it lets us practice a fundamental human necessity, being there in the world without needing to become anything at all. Thank you for diving deep with us.